The Atrahasis Epic stands as one of the oldest and most significant creation narratives from ancient Mesopotamia, a story that predates the biblical flood account by more than 1,000 years. This tale comes to us from the banks of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, from a time before empires consolidated their power, before written law codified human behavior, before the memory of kings hardened into monumental stone. Preserved on clay tablets that archaeologists would eventually recover from the ruins of Nineveh and Sippar, the epic tells of humanity's creation, near destruction, and ultimate preservation through wisdom and divine intervention. The narrative begins not with human history, but with the gods themselves, and with a problem that would eventually lead to the shaping of mortal existence. The story survives in fragments, broken clay tablets dug from ancient libraries, preserved by chance in the dry climate of the region. Scribes working by lamplight in temple complexes pressed these words into soft clay, using reed styluses, recording not mere stories, but sacred truths, foundational myths that explained why the world was as it was. They wrote in Akkadian, the language of Babylon and Assyria, though the story itself reaches back to Sumerian roots that predate even the earliest dynasties. When archaeologists first translated these tablets in the 19th century, they revealed a narrative that would reshape our understanding of ancient flood myths and creation stories. Here was a tale that preceded the biblical account by more than a millennium, yet bore striking resemblances to it, suggesting deep connections between the mythological traditions of the ancient Near East. In the beginning, before humanity walked the earth, there were only gods, and the gods were divided. The great Anunnaki, the seven who decreed fates, sat in council and contemplated the ordering of the cosmos, while beneath them laboured the Igigi, the lesser gods of heaven, who carried out the endless work of maintaining creation. For 40 years, some versions say, or perhaps it was twice 40, the Igigi dug the channels of the great rivers, hauled earth to build the mountains, and shaped the landscape of the world with their divine hands. The work was brutal, unceasing, measured not in days but in ages, and though they were gods, immortal and powerful, the Igigi grew weary. Their backs bent under the weight of baskets filled with soil, their hands cracked from the ceaseless labour. They knew neither rest nor reprieve, and slowly, like a fire fed by dry grass, resentment began to burn among them. The great gods who commanded this labour sat in their palace, untouched by the toil they had ordained. Anu, the distant sky father, occupied the highest heavens, remote and terrible in his silence. Enlil, lord of the wind and storm, god of kingship and authority, held dominion over the earth, and gave the commands that set the lesser gods to work. Enki, whom the Sumerians called Ea, the cunning lord of the deep waters and sweet springs beneath the earth, possessed wisdom beyond measure, but kept his counsel close. These were the architects of order, the shapers of cosmic law, and beneath their gaze the Igigi laboured for generations of divine time, until at last their patience shattered like sun-baked clay. The rebellion came not with thunder, but with flame. The Igigi gathered in secret, passing whispered words from one to another beneath the stars. They made a pact, and when the appointed night arrived, they set fire to their tools, cast down their baskets, and marched toward the house of Enlil, their torches blazing in the darkness like a river of fallen stars. The great god, roused from sleep, saw the fires approaching and felt something he had perhaps never known before, a tremor of uncertainty, a flicker of fear. He summoned Anu from the heavens and called for Enki to rise from the depths, and the three great gods convened in haste to understand what force had driven their servants to such desperate action. A messenger was sent to the assembled Igigi, and the lesser gods spoke their grievance plainly. The work was too much, they said. The burden was too great. They would serve no longer unless the order of things was changed. Enlil, proud and unyielding, was filled with rage at this defiance. He spoke of punishment, of casting down the rebels, of reasserting divine authority through force. The Igigi had broken the sacred hierarchy, violated the structure of creation itself, and for this they deserved only destruction. Anu, distant and measured, listened but offered no solution, for he understood that the work must continue, that the rivers must be maintained and the fields must be ordered, and without labourers, the cosmos itself would begin to fray. It was Enki, the wise one, the solver of riddles, who saw the path forward. If the Igigi would not labour, then new labourers must be created. If the gods would not bear the burden, then it must be passed to creatures shaped for that very purpose. And so the idea was born, strange and audacious, a solution that would reshape the nature of existence. Humanity would be made. The Council of the Gods deliberated on this proposal, weighing its merits and its dangers. To create a new race of beings, neither fully divine nor entirely animal, was to introduce something unprecedented into the order of things. These creatures would need to be strong enough to work the land, intelligent enough to understand commands, yet humble enough to serve without aspiring to godhood themselves. They would require hands to shape tools, voices to sing hymns, minds to comprehend ritual, but not so much awareness that they might question their station or rebel as the Igigi had done. The balance was delicate, and the method of creation would be crucial. Enki proposed a plan, and the gods, weary of conflict and eager for resolution, agreed to attempt it. They would make humanity from the substance of the earth itself, from clay drawn from the banks of the rivers, mixed with something more potent, more binding. They would use divine blood. A god would have to die for this creation to succeed. The assembly called forth one of their own, a god whose name in some versions is given as Geshtu-e, sometimes called Ilawela or We-Ila, a deity of limited power but sufficient divinity to serve the purpose. The texts do not linger on his character or his willingness, only on his fate. He was slain, struck down in a ritual act, and from his body the divine essence was harvested. His blood, still warm with the spark of immortality, was mixed with clay in a great basin, kneaded and worked until the substance held together, neither entirely earth nor entirely heaven. This was the primal matter from which humanity would be shaped, and it carried within it both the burden of labour and the trace of divine consciousness, the capacity for thought and memory that would make humans different from all other creatures. Nintu, the mother goddess, sometimes called Belet Eli, the lady of the gods, took the clay mixture in her hands and began to shape it. 14 pieces she formed, 7 male and 7 female, each one moulded with care, each one given the form of a body with limbs and features that echoed the divine image. The texts describe her work in terms both tender and mechanical, as a potter shapes vessels or a midwife delivers new life. She spoke incantations over the clay, blessing it and binding it, and when the forms were complete, she breathed into them. Or perhaps the gods breathed collectively and the clay stirred. Eyes opened, chests rose and fell. The first humans stood upon the earth, naked and trembling, covered in the dust from which they had been made. They looked upon the gods with awe and incomprehension, and the gods looked back and saw their answer to the problem of labour. The burden of the Igigi was lifted, and humanity took up the yoke. From that first generation, humans multiplied across the land. They built cities of mud brick in the river valleys, raised temples to honour the gods who had made them, and worked the fields with the diligence their creators had intended. They dug irrigation channels, carried baskets of grain, tended flocks of sheep and goats, and offered sacrifices of bread and beer at the appointed festivals. The gods withdrew to their distant palaces, content that the order of the cosmos had been restored, and for a time there was stability. The Anunnaki reclined in their halls while humanity toiled beneath the sun, and the smoke of human fires rose to heaven, carrying with it the scent of roasted meat and the sound of prayers. The arrangement seemed to function as designed, a hierarchy of divine command and mortal obedience, and the gods rested, believing the problem solved forever. Yet humanity, shaped from both earth and divine blood, carried within them a restlessness the gods had not anticipated. They multiplied with vigor, filling the river valleys and spilling into the plains beyond. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities grew dense with people, their voices rising in a clamour that echoed across the land. They worked, yes, but they also sang and quarrelled, celebrated and mourned, built markets and workshops, raised families and buried their dead. They were not silent, obedient tools, but living beings with desires and fears, and as their numbers grew, so too did the noise they made. The sound of humanity, the constant hum of life and activity, began to drift upward to the heavens, and there it became a problem. Enlil, the great god of storm and authority, found his rest disturbed by the ceaseless din rising from the earth below. Where once there had been order and quiet, now there was chaos, a cacophony of mortal voices that grated against his divine ear. At first, Enlil tolerated the noise, believing it would diminish with time or that the humans would learn restraint. But generations passed, and the population only increased. Cities sprawled wider, festivals grew louder. The earth itself seemed to tremble with the weight of so many footsteps, so many breaths, so many beating hearts. Enlil's patience, never generous to begin with, began to erode. He spoke in council of the need for control, of the danger posed by unchecked growth, and the other gods listened with varying degrees of concern. Anu, remote in his heavens, cared little for the affairs of the earth. Enki, ever the protector of humanity, argued for patience, suggesting that the noise was merely the sound of life flourishing, a natural consequence of successful creation. But Enlil would not be swayed. He saw in humanity's abundance not vitality, but threat, not blessing but burden, and he resolved to act. The gods who had created humanity to serve them would soon consider destroying them entirely. Enlil's solution was not immediate annihilation, but something more measured, more calibrated to test the limits of human endurance. He would reduce their numbers through affliction, thin the population until the noise subsided to acceptable levels, and teach humanity the cost of excess. The method he chose was plague, a divine sickness that would spread through the crowded cities like smoke through a reed house. He spoke the decree in council, and though Enki raised objections, the majority of the gods consented, weary themselves of the disturbance rising from the earth. The plague descended like an invisible hand, touching first one household, then another, moving through the narrow streets where people lived pressed close together, their homes sharing walls, their lives intertwined. Fevers came, and with them weakness, sores that would not heal, a wasting that left the afflicted hollow-eyed and trembling. In the cities along the Euphrates, in Shuruppak and Uruk, in settlements whose names have been lost to time, people began to fall ill. Mothers watched their children burn with fever. Fathers grew too weak to rise from their sleeping mats. The markets, once loud with haggling and laughter, grew quiet as fewer vendors appeared each day. Priests hurried between the sick, offering prayers and incense, but the plague respected neither piety nor rank. It took the young and the old, the strong and the frail, and left behind only grief and the smell of funeral pyres. The living dug graves in the earth outside the city walls, lowering their dead into the ground with whispered farewells, and the smoke of cremation fires drifted upward, a different kind of noise, the silent cry of human suffering. For a time, It seemed that Enlil's plan would succeed, that humanity would be reduced to a manageable remnant, chastened and diminished. But Enki, the wise god who dwelt in the depths, had not forgotten the humans he had helped to create. He watched their suffering with something the other gods perhaps did not feel, a concern that bordered on affection, or perhaps merely an unwillingness to see his creation undone so carelessly. Enki moved in secret, working through dreams and whispers, sending knowledge to those who might use it. In Shuruppak, there lived a man named Atrahasis, whose name meant exceedingly wise, a man who served as priest and counselor to his community. He was pious and attentive, and when Enki spoke to him in the stillness of night, he listened. The god instructed him to gather the people, to make offerings not to Enlil, but to Namtar, the demon of plague, to seek the favor of the affliction's source rather than appealing to the god who had sent it. Atrahasis did as he was commanded, and slowly, mysteriously, the plague began to lift. The fevered cooled, the weak grew strong again. Life returned to the streets of Shuruppak, and the noise of humanity resumed. Enlil, in his distant palace, heard the renewed clamour and felt his anger sharpen. The plague had failed. Humanity had survived and multiplied once more, their voices rising with renewed vigour, their cities rebuilding with determined hands. He convened the council again, and this time his patience was thinner, his resolve harder. If disease would not reduce them, then he would withhold the very substance of life. He decreed a drought, commanding Adad, the storm god, to hold back the rains. No clouds would gather, no water would fall. The rivers would shrink to shallow channels, and the fields would crack under the merciless sun. Humanity would learn what it meant to depend entirely on the mercy of the gods, and perhaps in their desperation they would grow quieter, more humble, more aware of their place in the order of things. The drought descended over Mesopotamia like a curtain of brass. The sky, once generous with rain in the winter months, became hard and blue, unyielding day after day. The first season without rain brought concern but not panic, for the people were accustomed to dry spells and the rivers still flowed with water from distant mountains. But the second year brought no rain either, and the third year saw the Euphrates and Tigris sink lower in their channels, exposing banks of cracked mud and stones that had not seen sunlight in generations. Farmers watched their fields wither, the barley stalks turning brown before they could produce grain, the date palms dropping their fruit unripe and shriveled. The irrigation channels, those lifelines of Mesopotamian agriculture, ran dry or carried only trickles of brackish water. Animals grew lean, their ribs visible beneath dusty hides, and herdsmen drove them farther afield in search of grazing, finding only thorns and barren ground. In the cities, water became precious. Wells that had never failed began to run low, and people rationed what they drew, measuring it in careful handfuls. The markets emptied of food. Granaries, once full from years of surplus, were opened and rationed, but the stores dwindled faster than anyone had anticipated. Children cried from hunger, their bellies swollen, their limbs thin as reeds. The elderly, weakened by privation, began to die, and there was barely strength left among the living to bury them. Dust storms swept across the land, driven by hot winds that carried no relief. Only grit that coated everything, infiltrating homes, covering altars, settling like ash on the lips of the desperate. People prayed in the temples, offering what little they had, but the heavens remained silent and the earth remained dry. The noise that had so offended Enlil grew quieter, replaced by the thin wails of starvation and the shuffle of weakened feet. Once again, Atrahasis sought guidance, and once again Enki answered. The god of wisdom instructed the people to cease their offerings to all the gods and to direct their worship solely to Idad, the bringer of storms. They were to honor him with whatever they could spare, to sing his praises even as their throats were parched, to call his name until he could no longer ignore them. Atrahasis led the people in this concentrated devotion, and the smoke of their meager offerings rose to heaven. Adad, moved by their persistence, or perhaps weary of bearing Enlil's command, relented. Clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy, and when the first drops of rain fell, the people wept with relief. The drought broke. Water rushed through the channels, filled the cisterns, soaked into the grateful earth. Seeds sprouted, crops grew. Humanity, resilient and resourceful, rebuilt once more, and the population began to climb again toward its former numbers. Enlil's fury now became something colder, more implacable. Twice he had acted, and twice Enki had undermined him, guiding humanity through the punishments meant to reduce them. The god of storms saw in this pattern a deeper challenge, not merely to his will, but to the hierarchy of divine authority itself. If Enki would not respect the council's decisions, if he would continue to aid the humans in defiance of divine decree, then more drastic measures were required. Enlil decreed a third affliction, more severe than plague or drought. He commanded that the earth itself cease to produce, that the very fertility of the soil be withdrawn. No amount of rain would help if the ground refused to yield. The fields would grow nothing, no matter how carefully tended. The date palms would bear no fruit. The fish would vanish from the rivers. Humanity would face not merely hardship, but the slow certainty of extinction through famine. This final curse fell upon the land with terrible completeness. Even when rains came, the seeds planted in the earth failed to sprout, or sprouted only to wither immediately, as if the soil had forgotten its purpose. The date palms stood barren, their fronds rustling in the wind but producing nothing. Fishermen cast their nets into the rivers and drew them up empty, the waters seemingly devoid of life. Wild animals grew scarce, fleeing to distant regions or simply vanishing, as if the land itself had become hostile to all living things. Hunger deepened into starvation. People grew desperate, eating bark stripped from trees, grinding roots into paste, boiling leather straps to extract whatever nourishment they might hold. The social order began to fray. Neighbors turned against neighbors over scraps of food. Families made unthinkable choices. The cities, once bustling centers of trade and worship, became places of hollow-eyed silence broken only by weeping. Atrahasis, seeing his people on the edge of oblivion, cried out to Enki with an urgency born of despair. The god heard him and responded, though even Enki's power had limits when confronted with Enlil's direct command and the consent of the divine council. He could not simply reverse the curse, but he could offer guidance, a path through the darkness if the people had strength to follow it. Enki instructed Atrahasis to organize the survivors, to share all resources equally, to maintain order and compassion even as the world collapsed around them. He taught them to fish in the deep waters where Enlil's curse held less power, to gather food from the marshes where the boundary between earth and water blurred, to survive on the margins until the crisis passed. Through Enki's wisdom and the endurance of the people, a remnant persisted, clinging to life with determination that bordered on defiance. But Enlil, watching from above, saw that even this most severe punishment had not silenced humanity completely. A stubborn core remained, guided by Enki, refusing to disappear into extinction. The god of storms understood now that partial measures would never suffice, that as long as Enki intervened, humanity would find a way to survive and multiply again. The solution, therefore, had to be absolute. Not plague that might be cured, not drought that might be broken, not even famine that might be endured. but total annihilation, a cleansing so complete that no human voice would remain to disturb the cosmic order. Enlil conceived of a weapon beyond disease or privation, something primal and unstoppable. He would unleash the waters of the deep, the floods that existed before creation, the chaos that the gods had once bound and ordered. He would unmake the world, drown it in a deluge that would erase every trace of human civilization, and from the silence that followed, the gods could begin again, more carefully this time, with greater caution. The plan was presented to the divine council in secret, or as much secrecy as gods could maintain among themselves. Enlil demanded that all the Anunnaki swear an oath not to reveal what was coming, not to warn any human of the approaching destruction. The flood would fall upon humanity without warning, swift and complete, leaving no time for preparation or escape. The gods, weary of the ongoing conflict and perhaps sympathetic to Enlil's frustration, agreed to the oath. One by one they swore, binding themselves to silence. Even Enki, though his heart rebelled against the decision, could not refuse the oath without breaking the fundamental bonds of divine order. He swore as the others did, his voice joining theirs in solemn agreement. The decision was sealed, the flood was coming. Humanity's days were numbered, and the count was growing short. Enlil withdrew to make his preparations, to gather the waters and set them in motion, and across the heavens a silence fell, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Enki, bound by oath yet unwilling to see his creation destroyed, found himself caught between divine law and personal conviction. He had sworn not to warn any human of the coming flood, and such oaths, when made before the assembled gods, carried weight that not even the wisest deity could easily dismiss. To break such a vow would be to shatter the bonds that held the divine order together, to invite chaos into the council of heaven itself. Yet to remain silent would mean complicity in genocide, the erasure of every man, woman, and child who walked the earth. The god of wisdom sat in his palace beneath the waters, the Apsu, that freshwater realm where he dwelt in cool shadows far from the heat of the sun. He contemplated the problem with the focused intensity that had earned him his reputation as the cleverest of the gods. There had to be a way, some path that honoured the letter of his oath while defying its spirit, some method of communication that did not constitute a direct warning. In time, as the waters lapped against the foundations of his underwater halls, Enki found his answer. In Shuruppak, Atrahasis continued his duties as priest and counsellor, unaware of the doom that hung over the world like a storm cloud just beyond the horizon. He tended to the rituals, offered prayers at dawn and dusk, mediated disputes among his neighbours, and tried to guide his community through the lingering effects of the famine that had only recently begun to ease. His house stood near the temple precinct, a modest dwelling of mud brick with walls made from bundled reeds plastered with clay, the traditional construction method of the river valleys where wood was scarce and reeds grew in abundance along the marshy banks. The walls breathed with the seasons, expanding slightly when wet, contracting in the dry heat, a living boundary between interior and exterior. It was to one of these walls, a screen of woven reeds that formed the side of Atrahasis' sleeping chamber, that Enki came in the deep hours of night when the city slept and the stars turned overhead in their ancient patterns. The god did not appear in visible form, did not manifest with the blazing radiance that would mark a divine visitation. Instead, he came as a presence, a voice without body, and he spoke not to Atrahasis directly, but to the reed wall itself. The words were soft, scarcely louder than the wind that sometimes whispered through the city streets, but they were clear, deliberate, shaped with the precision of a craftsman setting stones. Enki addressed the wall, telling it of the decision made in the divine council, describing in careful detail the flood that Enlil had decreed, explaining that the waters would rise to cover the earth, that every living thing would perish beneath the deluge. He spoke of the need for a vessel, a great boat that could ride the waters and preserve life through the catastrophe. He described its dimensions, the materials required for its construction, the methods by which it should be sealed and made watertight. All of this he told to the wall, never once speaking directly to the man who lay just beyond it, technically fulfilling his oath, while ensuring that the warning reached its intended recipient. Atrahasis, lying in the darkness with his eyes open, listened to every word. At first he wondered if he dreamed, if the deprivations of the famine had weakened his mind and conjured phantoms from the shadows. But the voice was too clear, too specific, too detailed to be the product of fever or imagination. He recognized the presence of Enki, felt the characteristic coolness that accompanied the god of deep waters, and understood that what he heard was both warning and instruction. When the voice fell silent and the presence withdrew, Atrahasis rose from his sleeping mat and went to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. The moon hung low in the west, its light silvering the rooftops and the distant palms. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. The world seemed unchanged, peaceful even, but Atrahasis knew better. The gods had decreed destruction, and only divine intervention, delivered through the loophole of a clever oath, had given humanity one final chance at survival. He would need to act quickly, and he would need to be careful, for if Enlil learned of the warning before the boat was built, all would be lost. At dawn, Atrahasis gathered the elders of Shuruppak in the temple courtyard and spoke to them of a dream he had received. He did not mention Enki directly, did not speak of divine counsels or oaths, but told them that he had been instructed to build a great vessel, a boat unlike any they had seen, to preserve life through a coming trial. Some of the elders looked at him with skepticism, for Atrahasis was known as a wise man, but this proposal seemed extraordinary. Build a boat on dry land, far from deep water? Construct something large enough to house animals and supplies for an unknown duration. The resources alone would be staggering, the labour immense. But Atrahasis spoke with such conviction, such quiet certainty, that doubt began to give way to trust. He had guided them through plague and drought and famine. He had received wisdom from Enki before. If he said a boat must be built, then perhaps it was worth the attempt, even if the reasons remained mysterious. The work began immediately. Atrahasis directed the dismantling of several houses on the edge of the settlement, salvaging their timber beams and reed bundles, gathering materials that would otherwise take months to accumulate. He sent parties to the marshes to cut fresh reeds by the thousands, binding them into tight bundles that could be layered and woven into walls. He organized teams to gather bitumen, the black sticky substance that seeped from the ground in certain places, valuable for waterproofing and sealing joints. Mesopotamia had little timber suitable for shipbuilding, no great forests of cedar or oak, so the vessel would need to be constructed primarily of reeds and bundles of marsh grass, layered thick and sealed with pitch until it could withstand the pressure of water from all sides. The design Enki had described was not elegant but functional. A rectangular box with a roof, windowless except for small openings near the top, divided into compartments within. It was not meant to sail or steer, only to float, to rise with the waters and remain intact until they subsided. The construction site became the center of activity in Shuruppak. Men and women worked side by side, some weaving reeds into massive mats that would form the walls, others mixing clay and straw to create the daub that would cover the exterior, still others heating bitumen over fires until it became liquid enough to brush onto surfaces in thick, waterproof layers. Children carried water from the river and ran errands between work teams. The elderly, too weak for heavy labor, sat in the shade and wove smaller reeds into rope and binding material. The boat grew slowly, layer upon layer, rising from the ground like a strange temple dedicated to an unknown purpose. Neighbors from other settlements heard of the project and came to observe, some offering help, others merely watching with curious eyes. Atrahasis explained that he was following divine instruction, preparing for a great trial, and most accepted this without further question, for in Mesopotamia the will of the gods was not to be debated but obeyed. As the boat took shape, Atrahasis began gathering supplies according to Enki's instructions. He collected grain in sealed jars, storing it in one of the internal compartments where it would remain dry. He gathered dates, dried fish, nuts, and preserved foods that could sustain life for an extended period. He instructed his family and helpers to bring containers of fresh water, for even surrounded by floodwaters, drinking water would be necessary. He gathered tools, rope, cooking vessels, oil lamps, and everything needed to maintain life in confined quarters. The boat's interior was divided into sections, some for humans, some for animals, for Enki had specified that representatives of living creatures must be preserved as well. Atrahasis began collecting animals, pairs of sheep and goats, cattle, donkeys, birds in woven cages, even dogs and cats. The people of Shuruppak watched this menagerie being led toward the boat and wondered at the purpose, but they trusted their priest and helped where they could. The work continued for weeks, perhaps months, the timeline blurred by the intensity of effort and the sense of racing against an invisible deadline. Atrahasis worked from dawn until well after dark, sleeping little, driving himself and his helpers with gentle but insistent urgency. The boat grew larger, its bitumen-sealed walls gleaming black in the sunlight, its dimensions impressive even to those who had seen the great barges that carried stone and timber along the rivers. It was not beautiful, this vessel, but it was solid, built with care and sealed with precision. Every joint was checked and rechecked. Every seam was painted with bitumen. The roof was constructed with a slight pitch to shed water and was fitted with small hatches that could be opened for air or sealed against the deluge. When at last the work was complete, the boat stood ready, a dark rectangular monolith resting on the dusty ground, waiting for waters that had not yet appeared. Atrahasis moved his family into the boat, along with a small group of helpers who had worked on its construction and whom he trusted to maintain secrecy and order during whatever trial lay ahead. They brought the animals aboard, guiding them up ramps and into their designated pens, settling the livestock with fodder and water. The birds were hung in their cages from the interior beams. The supplies were stacked in organized rows, labeled and inventoried. The boat became a floating storehouse of life, cramped and dark but functional, smelling of animals and bitumen and the dried grass of the reeds. When everyone and everything was aboard, Atrahasis sealed the main entrance from inside, using rope and wooden pegs to secure it tightly, then covering the seams with a final layer of pitch. They sat in the dim interior, lit only by a few oil lamps, and waited. Outside, the sky remained clear. The sun rose and set in its normal pattern. The world seemed unchanged, and some of those aboard began to wonder if the warning had been mistaken, if they had built this vessel for nothing. Then, in the stillness before dawn on the 7th day after they had sealed themselves inside, the first signs appeared. The air grew heavy, oppressive, charged with a tension that made it difficult to breathe. A hot wind began to blow from the south, carrying with it the smell of distant rain and something else, something older and more primal, the scent of deep water long confined. The animals grew restless, shifting in their pens, the cattle lowing softly, the sheep pressing against the walls. Birds fell silent. dogs whined and paced. Atrahasis stood in the center of the boat, his hand resting on one of the support beams, and felt through his feet the first faint tremor, a vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Somewhere far away, perhaps in the mountains where the rivers began, perhaps in the depths of the sea, or perhaps in the vault of heaven, where the gods maintained the boundaries between the waters above and the waters below, something had shifted. The locks were opening. The barriers were failing. The flood was beginning. The sound came first, a low rumble like distant thunder that did not fade but grew steadily louder. Those inside the boat clutched the walls and each other, listening as the rumble became a roar, as the roar became a crash of unimaginable volume, the sound of water meeting earth with the force of divine wrath. The boat shuddered. The world outside exploded into chaos. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in sheets, as if the sky had turned to liquid and was pouring itself onto the land. The rivers, already swollen, burst their banks and surged across the fields. Springs erupted from the ground, sending geysers of water into the air. The foundations of the deep cracked open, releasing the primordial waters that had been confined since creation. Every source of water, above and below, unleashed itself simultaneously, and the land that had been dry and ordered disappeared beneath the rising flood. The boat, suddenly buoyant, lurched upward, floating free from the ground that had held it, beginning its long drift on waters that would cover the world. The world ended not with fire but with water, not with a sudden crack of judgment, but with the slow, inexorable rising of the deep. In the first hours, those outside the boat who had not believed the warning scrambled to high ground, climbing to rooftops and hilltops, clutching their children and crying out to the gods for mercy that would not come. The water rose with terrifying speed, swallowing streets and doorways, filling the lower rooms of houses, turning alleys into canals and plazas into lakes. The rivers that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for generations became instruments of destruction, their boundaries dissolved, their currents merging into a single vast flood that recognized no banks or channels. People clung to whatever they could find, floating debris, uprooted trees, fragments of walls, but the rain fell without ceasing and the waters climbed higher. What had been the known world, the ordered landscape of cities and fields and irrigation works, disappeared beneath a surface that stretched unbroken to every horizon. Inside the boat, Atrahasis and those with him experienced the flood not through sight, but through sound and motion. The vessel, sealed tightly against the deluge, became a dark world unto itself, lit only by the flickering flames of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the reed walls. They felt the boat rise as the waters lifted it, felt the strange sensation of floating where solid ground had been moments before. The craft rocked and swayed, caught in currents they could not see, bumping occasionally against objects in the water, the sounds muffled but distinct. The roar of the rain on the roof was constant, a percussion so loud that conversation required raised voices. Water found small gaps in the ceiling and dripped through in thin streams, and Atrahasis and his helpers moved through the dim interior with bowls and rags, catching the leaks and patching them with fresh bitumen carried in sealed jars for this purpose. The animals, disoriented by the movement and the noise, bleated and lowed and shifted in their pens, adding their voices to the cacophony. Time became difficult to measure in the darkness. The boat had no windows save the small openings near the roof, and these Atrahasis kept sealed against the rain. Day and night blended together into a continuous present, defined only by the rhythm of necessary tasks. Animals needed to be fed and watered. Waste needed to be collected and stored in designated containers, for nothing could be thrown overboard without opening a hatch and risking the entry of floodwater. The humans needed to eat, to sleep in shifts, to maintain the lamps and check the seals. Atrahasis established a routine, dividing his companions into watches, ensuring that someone was always awake to monitor the boat's condition. The work was exhausting, repetitive, performed in cramped quarters where every movement required negotiation with others sharing the limited space. The air grew thick with the smell of animals and lamp oil and unwashed bodies, and breathing became an effort, each inhalation drawing in the heavy atmosphere of confinement. Outside, beyond the sealed walls, the destruction continued. The waters rose to cover the tallest buildings, the highest hills, the peaks of mountains that had stood since the world's ordering, everything humanity had built, every temple and palace, every market and workshop, every humble dwelling and grand monument sank beneath the flood. The cities of Mesopotamia, with their ziggurats reaching toward heaven, their wall built to last generations, their libraries of clay tablets inscribed with law and poetry and prayers, all disappeared into the depths. The carefully tended fields where farmers had worked since the first planting, the orchards of dates and figs that had fed countless families, the networks of irrigation channels that represented centuries of engineering and labour, all were obliterated, reduced to nothing by water that cared for no human achievement. The bodies of those who had drowned floated on the surface for a time, then sank, joining the ruins in the dark water where nothing living could survive. The gods, watching from their distant palaces, saw what they had wrought and felt the enormity of it settle upon them like a weight. Enlil, in his palace of wind and storm, observed the destruction with grim satisfaction, believing that at last the problem of humanity had been solved, that the noise that had disturbed his rest would trouble him no more. The other gods, however, began to feel something they had perhaps not anticipated, a creeping horror at the totality of the annihilation. Nintu, the mother goddess who had shaped the first humans from clay, looked down at the drowned world and wept. She had created those forms with her own hands, breathed life into them, sent them into the world with a blessing. Now they were gone, every one, or so it seemed. The Anunnaki, gathered in their heavens, watched the waters cover everything and felt a profound unease. What had been done could not be undone. The world below was silent, emptied of human voices, and in that silence they heard the echo of their own decision. The rain fell for 7 days and 7 nights without pause, a cosmic deluge that poured from the opened windows of heaven and welled up from the broken fountains of the deep. The waters reached their height and held there, a universal ocean covering the entire world, drowning mountains and valleys alike beneath its grey expanse. The boat drifted on this featureless sea, tossed by waves, turned by currents, moving in directions its passengers could not determine. Atrahasis had no way to steer the vessel, no rudder or sail, only the hope that it would remain intact and that eventually the waters would subside. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, a long dark interval of waiting marked only by the slow consumption of supplies and the gradual adaptation to conditions that seemed designed to test the limits of endurance. The initial panic faded into a kind of numb acceptance. This was their existence now, this floating prison, this ark of preservation adrift on waters that covered a dead world. The psychological strain was as challenging as the physical hardship. In the confined darkness, with no horizon to give perspective and no solid ground to provide stability, the mind played tricks. Some aboard struggled with claustrophobia, feeling the walls pressing in, their breath coming short despite adequate air. Others fell into despondency, questioning whether survival in these conditions was worth the effort, whether it might have been better to perish quickly in the initial flood than to linger in this limbo. Atrahasis moved among them, offering what comfort he could, reminding them of Enki's promise, speaking of a time when the waters would recede and solid ground would appear again. He led prayers at regular intervals, maintaining the rituals that connected them to the divine order, even as that order seemed to have abandoned the world. His presence, calm and steady, became an anchor for the others, a reminder that purpose and hope could exist even in the darkest circumstances. The animals suffered too, confined in spaces barely adequate for their needs, deprived of sunlight and fresh air, forced into proximity with species they would normally avoid. Some grew sick and died despite the care given them, their bodies added to the accumulating waste that had nowhere to go. The survivors grew listless, their eyes dull, their movements mechanical. Atrahasis did what he could to ease their distress, speaking to them in low voices, adjusting their fodder, ensuring they had water. But he understood that the animals, like the humans, were enduring something unnatural, something that violated the proper order of life. They had been created for solid earth, for fields and forests, for the open sky. This floating existence was alien to their nature, and it wore on them with each passing day. Yet they persisted, as life persists, clinging to existence with the same stubborn determination that had brought them aboard in the first place. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, changes began to occur. The constant drumming of rain on the roof, which had formed the background noise of their existence for so long, began to lessen. The downpour became a steady rain. The steady rain became intermittent showers. The showers became occasional drops. Atrahasis, noticing this shift, allowed himself a cautious hope. He opened one of the small roof hatches for the first time in months, admitting a shaft of grey daylight that seemed blinding after so long in the lamplit gloom. Fresh air rushed in, cool and damp but infinitely cleaner than the stale atmosphere inside. Those near the opening breathed deeply, tilting their faces toward the light like plants seeking the sun. Through the hatch, Atrahasis could see only water, an endless grey expanse stretching to the horizon under heavy clouds, but the rain had indeed stopped. The deluge was ending. The waters had reached their limit and would rise no further. The next change came more slowly still. The boat, which had been in constant motion, rocking and drifting with the currents, began to move differently, its motion becoming more constrained, as if encountering resistance. At first, Atrahasis thought they had struck debris, some large piece of floating wreckage, but the sensation persisted and grew stronger. The vessel seemed to be settling, sinking slightly, touching something solid beneath the surface. He realized with a start that the waters were receding, that somewhere below them the peaks of mountains or hills were rising from the flood, and that their boat had come to rest upon one of these. The craft tilted slightly as it settled onto uneven ground, then stabilized. For the first time since the flood began, they were no longer adrift. They were grounded, resting on something substantial, even if that ground remained far beneath the surface of the waters. It was a small change, but it marked a turning point, the beginning of the end of the deluge. Atrahasis announced this to the others, and a tremor of excitement passed through the boat's dim interior. After so long in the floating darkness, the promise of solid ground, even unseen and submerged, carried profound psychological weight. They were no longer merely surviving, but moving toward restoration, toward a return to the proper order of things. The waiting, though it would continue for many more days, took on a different quality now, became expectant rather than simply enduring. They maintained their routines, but with renewed energy, caring for the animals with greater attention, organizing the supplies that remained, preparing for the eventual moment when they could emerge. Atrahasis spent more time at the roof hatch, watching the waters and the sky, looking for further signs of change, measuring the slow retreat of the flood with the eye of someone who had learned patience through suffering. The waters receded gradually, revealing first the highest peaks, dark shapes breaking the surface like the backs of sleeping giants, then the ridges and slopes, then the valleys between. The world emerged from the flood scarred and strange, covered in silt and debris, emptied of vegetation, silent except for the wind and the lapping of the retreating waters. No smoke rose from cities, no paths wound through the hills, no sounds of human activity carried across the landscape. The earth was as it had been before the gods had shaped it for habitation, raw and primal and waiting. Atrahasis watched this slow revelation with mixed feelings. Relief that the flood was ending, yes, but also grief for what had been lost, and apprehension about what would come next. They had survived, but survival was only the beginning. The world they returned to would not be the world they had left. Everything would need to be built again, from the beginning, with only the handful of souls inside this boat to do the work. The boat rested on the mountain for many days as the waters continued their slow retreat down the slopes, revealing more of the peak with each passing sunrise. Atrahasis waited, exercising the patience that had sustained him through the long months of confinement, knowing that to emerge too soon would be to risk stepping into mud too soft to support weight, or finding air still too saturated with moisture to breathe comfortably. He watched through the roof hatch as the water level dropped visibly day by day, exposing first bare rock, then patches of silt-covered ground, then wider expanses of earth that steamed in the occasional sunlight as they dried. Birds appeared, the first living creatures from outside the boat that they had seen since the flood began, dark shapes wheeling against the clouds, and their cries carried across the empty landscape with startling clarity in the absence of any other sound. When at last the ground around the boat seemed firm enough to support them, when the waters had receded far enough that they could see valleys and distant plains beginning to emerge, Atrahasis made the decision to open the main hatch. The seals had hardened over the months, the bitumen and rope forming a barrier that resisted his initial efforts, but with the help of the others he worked the fastenings loose, peeling away the layers of protection that had kept the flood at bay. The hatch swung open with a groan of stressed wood and stretched fibre, and light flooded into the interior. Real sunlight, pale and watery, but infinitely brighter than the oil lamps that had been their only illumination. The air that rushed in was cold and clean, carrying the smell of wet earth and rock, and those nearest the opening stood transfixed, breathing deeply, filling their lungs with air that had not been recycled through confined space 1,000 times. Atrahasis was the first to step out onto the mountain. He climbed through the hatch and stood on the roof of the boat, then descended using the same ramps they had built for loading the animals, his feet touching solid ground for the first time since the flood began. The sensation was profound, almost overwhelming. The earth felt stable beneath him, unmoving, permanent in a way that the floating boat had never been. He walked a few paces from the vessel, his legs unsteady after so long adjusting to the boat's motion, and looked out across the transformed landscape. The mountain on which they had landed rose barren and grey, its slopes covered in a thick layer of silt that was already beginning to crack and dry. Below, stretching to every horizon, the receding waters left behind a world scrubbed clean of familiar markers. No cities were visible, no fields or roads, no trees or vegetation of any kind. The earth had been returned to something like its original state, formless and empty, waiting to be filled. The others emerged slowly, each person pausing at the threshold as Atrahasis had, taking in the strangeness of the world beyond the boat. They helped the animals down the ramps, guiding the cattle and sheep and goats onto the mountainside, where the creatures stood blinking in the daylight, their legs trembling, their instincts uncertain in this alien landscape. The birds were released from their cages and took flight immediately, scattering in all directions as if desperate to escape confinement, their wings beating hard against the thin mountain air. The dogs and cats prowled the perimeter of the boat, sniffing the ground, marking territory, re-establishing some sense of place and boundary. For a time, the survivors simply stood or sat on the rocks, silent, absorbing the reality of their situation. They had survived the flood, they were alive, but they were also profoundly alone, the only human voices in a world that had been emptied of all others. Atrahasis understood that the first task must be to give thanks, to acknowledge the divine power that had preserved them, and to re-establish the broken connection between earth and heaven. He gathered materials for a sacrifice, wood salvaged from the boat itself, for there were no trees on the barren mountainside, and prepared an altar from stones he collected and stacked with care. He selected animals from those they had saved, choosing from among the clean beasts according to the ritual practices he had maintained throughout his life, and slaughtered them with the proper prayers and gestures. The blood he poured onto the stone altar, and the meat he arranged on the wood, then set fire to the offering. The flames rose, fed by the dry wood and the rendered fat, and smoke climbed into the sky, a thin grey column rising from the mountain peak, the first sacrifice offered to the gods since the world had drowned. The smoke ascended through the cold air, rising high above the mountain, climbing toward the realm of the gods who had not descended to earth since the flood began. In their palaces, the divine beings had withdrawn into a kind of shocked silence, dealing with the aftermath of what they had done in ways both subtle and profound. Nintu, the mother goddess, had wept until her eyes were dry, mourning the humans she had shaped with her own hands. The Anunnaki sat in their council halls without speaking, each contemplating the enormity of the erasure they had permitted. Even Enlil, who had commanded the flood, found no satisfaction in the silence that now reigned over the earth. The noise that had disturbed him was gone. Yes, but with it had gone something else, some vitality and energy that he had not realized he would miss. The world below was empty, sterile, lifeless, except for the animals that wandered without purpose. There was no worship, no prayer, no offerings. The gods, for the first time since humanity's creation, received nothing from the earth. Then the smell reached them, drifting up from the mountain where Atrahasis had built his altar. The scent of roasting meat, the distinctive aroma of sacrifice properly performed, carried on the wind and entered the divine realm like a memory of something lost. The gods, who had not received offerings in months, responded with an intensity that surprised even themselves. They gathered around the ascending smoke like flies to honey, drawn by the fragrance, by the familiar ritual, by the evidence that worship had not entirely vanished from the world. The text described them as crowding around the sacrifice, eager for the offering, their divine hunger revealing a dependence they had not acknowledged. They needed humanity, needed the prayers and offerings and rituals that validated their power and sustained their position. Without worshippers, what were gods? The smoke from Atrahasis' sacrifice reminded them of this fundamental truth, and they breathed it in with gratitude and relief. Enlil, arriving late to the gathering, saw the assembled gods around the sacrifice and understood immediately what had happened. Someone had survived. Despite the flood, despite the divine decree, despite the oath sworn by all the Anunnaki to remain silent, at least one human had escaped destruction and now stood on the mountain offering worship. His rage ignited like lightning in a summer storm. He demanded to know who had violated the agreement, who had warned the humans of the coming deluge. His voice carried across the divine realm with the force of thunder, and the other gods fell back, unwilling to meet his gaze, unwilling to answer his question. The council had sworn an oath together, and if one had broken it, all bore the stain of that violation. The silence stretched, heavy with accusation and guilt, until Enki stepped forward, calm and deliberate, ready to defend what he had done. Enki spoke without apology or pretense. He explained how he had kept the letter of his oath while defying its spirit, how he had spoken to a reed wall rather than directly to Atrahasis, how he had found a path between divine law and personal conviction. He argued that the complete destruction of humanity had been a mistake, that the gods needed mortals as much as mortals needed gods, that the noise Enlil had found so disturbing was simply the sound of life, and that silencing it entirely served no one. He pointed to the smoke rising from the mountain, to the sacrifice that even now fed the divine appetite, and asked whether the world was better for being empty. The other gods, emboldened by Enki's defense, began to murmur their agreement. Nintu spoke of the grief she had felt watching her creations drown. Other deities added their voices, expressing regret for the decision they had made in haste and anger. The tide of opinion turned, slowly but unmistakably, against Enlil's absolute position. Enlil, confronted by this united opposition, felt his anger transform into something more complex. He saw that he stood alone in his insistence on total destruction, that even his authority as the great god of wind and kingship could not override the collective will of the divine assembly. He had won his silence, achieved the erasure he demanded, but in doing so he had revealed the limitations of his power and the isolation of his position. The world needed balance, needed both divine order and mortal activity, needed the noise of life as much as it needed the quiet of the heavens. Slowly, grudgingly, Enlil began to accept this reality. He would not apologize for the flood, would not admit that the decision had been wrong, but neither would he insist on completing the destruction by eliminating the survivors. Instead, he would agree to a new arrangement, a compromise that would allow humanity to continue while addressing the concerns that had led to the deluge in the first place. The gods convened in formal council to determine the future relationship between divine and mortal realms. They acknowledged that humanity could not be allowed to multiply without limit, that some mechanism must exist to prevent the population from growing so large that its noise and activity again disturbed the cosmic order. Enki, ever the problem solver, proposed solutions that would naturally limit human numbers without requiring divine intervention. He suggested the introduction of mortality in a form more severe than before, diseases that would take some lives before they reached old age, difficulties in childbirth that would claim both mothers and infants, social structures that would prevent all women from bearing children. He proposed that some women would be barren, that some children would die young, that life itself would carry within it the seeds of limitation. These mechanisms, built into the fabric of human existence, would maintain the population at levels the gods could tolerate without necessitating another catastrophic intervention. The council debated these proposals at length, weighing the merits of each suggestion, considering the long-term implications of the choices they were making. Nintu agreed to the plan with sadness, understanding that it meant accepting suffering as an integral part of human life, but recognizing that this suffering was preferable to extinction. Anu gave his assent from his distant heaven, caring less about the details than about the restoration of order. Other gods added their own suggestions, refinements to the basic framework that Enki had proposed. Through this process of collective decision-making, a new covenant was forged, an agreement that would govern the relationship between gods and humans for all the ages to come. Humanity would be allowed to survive and multiply, but within limits. They would worship the gods and offer sacrifices, but they would also suffer and die. The balance would be maintained through the natural rhythms of life and death, birth and barrenness, health and disease, rather than through periodic catastrophic purges. With this agreement reached, the gods turned their attention to Atrahasis, still standing on the mountain beside his altar, unaware of the deliberations taking place in the realm above. They determined to bless him for his faithfulness and his survival, to mark him as the progenitor of renewed humanity, and to grant him a long life so that he might see his descendants spread across the earth once more. Some versions of the story say that Atrahasis and his wife were granted immortality and taken to dwell in a distant paradise at the mouth of the rivers, removed from the mortal world but preserved forever as witnesses to the flood. Other versions simply record that he lived to a great age, guiding the rebuilding of civilization before passing peacefully into death. The details vary, but the essence remains constant. Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, had saved humanity from destruction and secured a future for the race that the gods had nearly erased. His name would be remembered in the tablets and songs of Mesopotamia for thousands of years, a symbol of survival and wisdom in the face of divine wrath. The mountain, though it had been their salvation, could not become their permanent home. The peak was barren, exposed to winds that carried the chill of high altitudes, devoid of soil deep enough to support cultivation or shelter, substantial enough to endure the changing seasons. Atrahasis understood that they would need to descend to find the river valleys where the silt deposited by the flood would create fertile ground, where water flowed year-round and the climate was mild enough for crops to grow. The journey down would be difficult, requiring them to navigate slopes still slick with mud, to cross ravines carved by the retreating waters, to move the animals and supplies that had sustained them through the flood. They rested for several days, allowing their bodies to adjust to solid ground, gathering strength for the trek ahead, and preparing the materials they would carry with them into the uncertain lowlands. The descent began at dawn on a morning when the sky was clear and the air was still. Atrahasis led the way, picking a path down the mountainside that avoided the steepest slopes and the areas where the ground seemed unstable. Behind him came his wife and the other survivors, each carrying bundles of supplies salvaged from the boat, tools and seeds, and containers of precious water. The animals followed, guided by ropes and the patient coaxing of those who had tended them throughout the flood. The cattle moved slowly, their hooves slipping occasionally on the muddy rocks, and the sheep clustered together, bleating their discomfort at the unfamiliar terrain. The journey that in normal times might have taken a single day stretched into 3, then 4, as they paused frequently to rest, to adjust their loads, to help animals that had stumbled or supplies that had shifted. The mountain yielded them gradually, releasing them from its heights back toward the world of rivers and plains. As they descended, the landscape began to change. The bare rock of the upper slopes gave way to areas where the flood's silt had collected in depressions and valleys, creating patches of dark, rich soil that contrasted sharply with the grey stone. These deposits, though still damp and occasionally treacherous, held the promise of future fertility. The minerals and organic matter carried from every part of the world and concentrated by the water's recession. Atrahasis paused to examine the soil, letting it run through his fingers, feeling its texture, noting its composition. It was different from the earth he had known before the flood, a mixture of elements that had never before been combined in quite this way. He did not know whether crops would grow in it, whether the familiar seeds they carried would sprout in this transformed ground, but he understood that this was the earth they had been given, and they would need to work with it or perish. By the time they reached the foothills, the world had begun to show other signs of recovery. Small plants appeared in scattered locations, green shoots pushing through the silt, weeds and grasses that had somehow survived as seeds or roots deep enough to escape the flood's destruction. These first pioneers of the new vegetation were tough and unremarkable, the kind of plants that colonized disturbed ground everywhere. But to the survivors, they were beautiful, evidence that life's capacity to regenerate had not been entirely extinguished. Birds had already discovered these plants, scratching in the soil for seeds, and insects moved among the stems, beginning the slow work of pollination and decomposition that would gradually build the foundation for more complex ecosystems. The world was healing itself, though the process would take years, perhaps generations, before it resembled the richness that had existed before the deluge. They continued into the lowlands, following what had once been a river valley, now filled with standing water and thick mud. The flood had rearranged the geography, filling some channels and carving new ones, leaving behind a landscape that looked both familiar and strange. Atrahasis recognized the general contours of the land, remembered which directions the rivers had flowed, where cities had stood, where fields had stretched to the horizon, but all the specific details had been erased. There were no ruins visible, no remnants of buildings or roads, or the infrastructure of civilization. Everything had been buried under layers of silt or washed away entirely, and what remained was raw earth waiting to be shaped again. It was both liberating and terrifying, this blank slate, this opportunity to begin anew without the weight of the past, but also without its guidance and accumulated wisdom. They settled finally in a location where a spring emerged from the ground, its water clear and cold, bubbling up from some deep source that the flood had not contaminated. Around this spring, on slightly elevated ground that the receding waters had left relatively dry, they established their first camp. Using materials salvaged from the boat and whatever they could gather from the transformed landscape, they built simple shelters, reed structures similar to those that had housed Mesopotamian peoples for generations before the flood. The work was familiar, the techniques passed down through countless generations, and performing these ancient tasks in the New World created a sense of continuity, a bridge between what had been lost and what might yet be built. They wove reeds into mats and walls, plastered them with mud mixed with straw, constructed roofs that would shed rain and provide shade from the sun. The shelters were crude compared to the houses they had known in Shurapak, but they were functional, and they marked the beginning of human habitation in the post-flood world. The animals were released to graze on the sparse vegetation that had begun to appear, though they remained near the camp, instinctively reluctant to wander far from the humans who had sustained them through the flood. The cattle found patches of grass and sedge growing near the water. The sheep browsed on the tough weeds that colonized the silt. The goats, ever adaptable, ate whatever they could reach, even sampling bark from the few small trees that had somehow survived or regenerated. Watching the animals spread out across the landscape, Atrahasis felt a measure of hope. If the animals could survive here, could find food and water and eventually breed, then perhaps humans could do the same. The covenant the gods had made, though he knew nothing of its specific terms, seemed to be holding. Life would continue. The world would be inhabited again. The silence that had followed the flood would gradually be broken by voices and activity, though never again with the thoughtless abundance that had provoked Enlil's wrath. The first task, beyond simple survival, was agriculture. Atrahasis and his companions had carried seeds from the boat, precious stores of barley and wheat, lentils and chickpeas, onions and other vegetables that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. These seeds represented continuity with the past, the genetic heritage of countless harvests and careful selections by farmers who had worked the land before the flood. Whether these seeds would grow in the transformed soil remained uncertain, but they were all that remained, and so the attempt had to be made. They cleared a plot of ground near the spring, pulling up the weeds that had already established themselves, breaking up the crusted surface of the silt, working the earth with tools made from salvaged wood and bone. The ground was heavy, difficult to work, very different from the sandy loam they had known, but they persevered, driven by the knowledge that failure would mean starvation when their salvaged supplies ran out. The planting was done with ceremony, with prayers offered to the gods who controlled rain and sun and the fertility of the earth. Atrahasis scattered the barley seeds with the traditional gestures, walking the field in the prescribed patterns, speaking the words that farmers had always spoken at planting time. The others followed with the other seeds, each type given its designated area, each planting accompanied by hopes and fears in equal measure. They watered the field from the spring, carrying water in vessels that had survived the flood, and waited for the seeds to germinate. days passed with agonizing slowness. The earth gave no sign of responding to their labor. The surface remained cracked and barren, showing no hint of the green that should appear when seeds sprout. Doubts crept in. Perhaps the seeds had been damaged by the long storage in the boat's damp interior. Perhaps the soil, for all its apparent richness, lacked some essential element. Perhaps the gods, having agreed to preserve humanity, had not agreed to make survival easy. Then, on the 10th day after planting, the first shoots appeared, tiny green points pushing through the dark earth, so small they were almost invisible but unmistakable to eyes that had been watching with desperate attention. Within days, the entire field showed growth, a faint green haze spreading across the brown, and the survivors gathered to witness this miracle of renewal. The seeds had survived. The soil would support crops. Agriculture was possible in this new world, and with agriculture came the foundation for everything else, for permanent settlement, for population growth, for the rebuilding of civilization. They tended the growing crops with devotion, protecting them from the few birds that appeared, watering them during dry spells, pulling weeds that competed for nutrients. The plants grew steadily, though their development seemed slower than crops had grown before the flood, and when harvest time came, the yield was modest, barely enough to sustain them and provide seed for the next planting, but it was enough. It proved that the cycle could continue. With crops established and the immediate crisis of survival addressed, Atrahasis began to think about the future, about the responsibilities that came with being the sole survivors of the human race. He understood that everything they did now would establish patterns for generations to come, that the choices they made about how to live, how to worship, how to organize their small community would echo through time and shape the civilization that would eventually re-emerge. He instituted regular worship, marking the days and seasons with offerings to the gods, maintaining the rituals that connected earth to heaven. He taught the younger survivors the stories of what had come before, describing the cities that had existed, the knowledge that had been accumulated, the mistakes that had led to the flood. These oral histories, passed from mouth to ear in the evenings around the fire, became the foundation of collective memory, ensuring that the lessons of the past would not be entirely lost, even though the physical evidence had been erased. As the first year in the new world turned toward its close, marked by the cycle of seasons that remained unchanged despite the transformation of the earth, the small community began to grow. Children were born, the first generation to have no memory of the world before the flood, and with their births came both joy and apprehension. Each child represented humanity's future, proof that the race would continue, but each also represented another voice that might eventually contribute to the noise that had so disturbed Enlil. Atrahasis taught the parents to raise their children with awareness of this balance, to instill in them respect for the gods and understanding of the consequences of excess. The new covenant, though he had not witnessed its making, was evident in the pattern of life itself. Not all children survived infancy. Some women struggled to conceive. Illness occasionally struck without warning. These hardships, painful as they were, seemed to be part of the divine design, the mechanisms by which population would be naturally limited without requiring another catastrophic intervention. The settlement grew slowly, year by year, as new shelters were built to accommodate the expanding population, as more fields were cleared and planted, as the herds of animals multiplied and required larger grazing areas. What had begun as a desperate camp around a spring gradually took on the character of a village, with defined pathways between dwellings, communal areas for gathering and worship, storage facilities for grain and tools. The people developed specializations, some focusing on agriculture, others on animal husbandry, still others on crafts like pottery and weaving that had been lost in the flood and needed to be reinvented from memory and experimentation. they learned to make new tools, to fire clay into vessels, to spin fibers into thread and weave thread into cloth. Each achievement was small in itself, but collectively they represented the slow resurrection of human culture, the rebuilding of the knowledge base that had been accumulated over thousands of years before the flood. Atrahasis, growing older, watched this revival with satisfaction mixed with sadness. He had saved humanity from extinction, had guided them through the initial hardships of the post-flood world, had established the foundations upon which a new civilization could be built. But he also carried the weight of memory, the knowledge of what had been lost, the awareness of how close everything had come to ending completely. He sat sometimes in the evenings, looking out across the growing settlement, and remembered Shurapak as it had been, the noise and bustle of the crowded streets, the markets filled with goods from distant lands, the temples rising high with their mud brick walls and reed mat roofs. All of that was gone, buried under silt or dissolved into formless mud, and it would take many generations before anything comparable would emerge again. The knowledge of this loss was his burden, the price of survival, and he bore it with the dignity of one who understood that memory, even painful memory, was itself a form of preservation. As the years accumulated and the settlement grew from a handful of shelters into a proper village, the question of expansion became unavoidable. The land around the spring could support only so many people, only so many fields and animals, before resources grew strained and conflicts began to emerge over access to water and grazing. Atrahasis, remembering the divine decree that humanity must not grow so numerous as to disturb the cosmic order, understood that expansion must be managed carefully, that new settlements should be established at distances great enough to prevent overcrowding while maintaining connections that would preserve shared knowledge and culture. He counseled the younger generation to explore the river valleys, to seek other springs and fertile areas where new communities could take root. And gradually, as children reached adulthood and formed families of their own, some began to depart, carrying with them seeds and animals and the stories of the flood, moving into the empty landscape to build lives in new locations. These departures were marked with ceremony, with blessings and gifts, with the recognition that each new settlement represented both loss and growth, a thinning of the parent community, but an expansion of humanity's presence on the earth. The departing families carried fire from the central hearth, a symbolic connection to the origin point, and promised to return periodically to share news and maintain kinship ties. They moved cautiously into the wilderness, following the courses of streams, looking for the telltale green of vegetation that indicated water and soil capable of supporting agriculture. Some settled only a few days' journey from the original village, establishing satellite communities that remained in close contact. Others ventured farther, drawn by curiosity or the desire for independence, crossing hills and valleys into regions that the flood had transformed beyond recognition, finding new springs and establishing themselves in locations that might one day grow into cities of their own. The process of settlement was neither smooth nor certain. Some of the new communities thrived, finding particularly fertile soil or advantageous locations near multiple water sources, and grew rapidly within the limits that mortality and hardship imposed. Others struggled, defeated by poor land or illness or simple bad fortune, and either returned to the parent village or were absorbed into more successful settlements. Through this gradual process of trial and error, success and failure, the surviving humans learned which locations could support permanent habitation and which should be used only for seasonal grazing or foraging. They developed knowledge of the transformed landscape, creating mental maps that noted springs and river crossings, clay deposits suitable for pottery, stands of reeds that could be harvested for construction. This knowledge, shared among the scattered communities through visits and intermarriage, became the foundation for a new geography, a collective understanding of the post-flood world that bore little resemblance to what had existed before. Trade emerged naturally as different settlements developed different specializations based on their local resources. A village near clay deposits became known for pottery, producing vessels that were traded for grain from agricultural settlements or wool from communities focused on herding. Knowledge of metalworking, which had been lost in the flood, along with all the tools and artifacts that represented thousands of years of technological development, began to be rediscovered through patient experimentation. Someone noticed that certain rocks, when heated in a fire, produced small beads of metal that could be hammered and shaped. This observation, shared and refined, led to the recovery of copper smelting and eventually to the production of simple tools that were stronger and more durable than anything that could be made from stone or bone. The spread of this knowledge among the settlements marked a turning point, a moment when the post-flood civilization began to approach the capabilities that had existed in the world before. Written language, that crucial technology that had allowed the preservation and transmission of complex information in the ancient cities, had been entirely lost in the flood. All the clay tablets inscribed with laws and poetry, with administrative records and religious texts, with the accumulated wisdom of countless scribes, had dissolved back into formless mud or been buried so deeply that they would not be discovered for thousands of years. Atrahasis, who had been literate in the old world, mourned this loss deeply, understanding that without writing, knowledge would be limited by the capacity of human memory and the reliability of oral transmission. He taught what he could remember to those who would listen, describing the symbols that had been used to represent sounds and ideas, explaining the methods by which words could be captured in clay and preserved across time. Some of the younger generation took interest in this teaching and began experimenting with ways to create permanent records, scratching marks into clay tablets, trying to develop a system that could carry meaning. These early attempts at recovering writing were crude compared to the sophisticated cuneiform script that had existed before the flood, but they represented the beginning of a process that would eventually lead to the full restoration of literacy. Simple pictographs emerged first, images that directly represented objects or ideas, a circle for the sun, a wavy line for water, a stick figure for a person. These symbols, standardized through usage and shared among the settlements, became the vocabulary of a proto-writing system that could record basic information, marking containers with their contents, noting quantities of goods in trade, recording the passage of seasons. It would take generations before this system evolved into something capable of capturing the full complexity of human thought and speech. But the foundation was being laid, knowledge recovering like a plant regrowing from roots that had survived beneath the surface. Religion in the post-flood world took on a character different from what it had been before the deluge. The temples that had dominated the cities of old Mesopotamia, with their towering ziggurats and professional priesthoods, their elaborate rituals and vast resources, could not be replicated by the small struggling settlements of the New Age. Instead, worship became more intimate and personal, focused on household shrines and seasonal festivals, on offerings made at springs and high places rather than in grand architectural spaces. Atrahasis maintained the traditional prayers and rituals as best he could remember them, teaching the proper forms of sacrifice and the correct days for various observances, but he also encouraged a simplicity and sincerity that he felt had sometimes been lacking in the institutional religion of the old world. The gods, he taught, required not elaborate ceremonies, but genuine devotion, not vast offerings, but regular acknowledgement of their power and mercy. The story of the flood itself became central to religious instruction, the foundational myth that explained the current relationship between gods and humans. Atrahasis told and retold the tale, describing the creation of humanity, the rebellion of the Igigi, the plagues and droughts and famines that had preceded the deluge, the building of the boat, the long months of confinement, the landing on the mountain, and the new covenant that had been established. Each telling refined the narrative, emphasized certain elements, smoothed rough edges, until the story took on the polished quality of sacred text, even though it was preserved only in memory. The younger generation, hearing these accounts from childhood, absorbed them as fundamental truths, as explanations for why the world was as it was, why suffering existed, why population was limited, why the gods demanded worship. The flood became not just a historical event, but a theological framework, a lens through which all subsequent experience was interpreted. As Atrahasis grew older, entering the long twilight years that the gods had granted him, he began to feel the weight of his unique position as a bridge between two worlds. He was the last person alive who had direct memory of civilization before the flood, the last who had walked the streets of Shurapak, who had seen the great cities in their glory, who had witnessed the erasure of that entire world. Everyone younger than him, even those who had survived the flood as children, had fragmented memories at best, impressions and images that grew less reliable with each passing year. He alone carried the complete narrative, the full weight of what had been lost and why. This knowledge was both precious and burdensome, and he felt an urgency to transmit as much of it as possible before his own death took it beyond reach. He gathered the community's best memorizers, those with the sharpest minds and most retentive memories, and worked with them to preserve the essential knowledge, repeating the stories and lessons until they could recite them perfectly. These memorizers became the first priests and scholars of the New Age, the keepers of tradition, and the teachers of the next generation. They memorized not only the flood narrative, but also the practical knowledge that Atrahasis had preserved from the Old World, techniques for agriculture and animal husbandry, principles of architecture and engineering, remedies for illness, methods of tracking time and predicting seasons. Some of this knowledge was immediately applicable and was put to use in the growing settlements. Other portions seemed arcane or impractical given current conditions, but Atrahasis insisted on preserving it anyway, arguing that future generations might find uses for information that seemed irrelevant now. The memorizers accepted this charge with solemnity, understanding that they were serving not just their own communities, but the entire future of humanity, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of thousands of years would not be completely lost. The settlements, scattered across the river valleys and plains, gradually developed distinct identities while maintaining enough contact to preserve a sense of shared origin. Different communities emphasized different aspects of the traditional practices, developed slight variations in dialect and custom, adapted to the specific conditions of their local environments. A settlement in a particularly dry area might emphasize water conservation and careful irrigation, developing expertise that others lacked. A community near forests might become skilled in woodworking, producing tools and structures different from those made by settlements where reeds remained the primary building material. These variations, rather than dividing humanity, created a rich tapestry of approaches and solutions, a diversity that proved valuable as conditions changed and new challenges emerged. When one community faced a problem, solutions developed elsewhere could be shared and adapted, creating a collective resilience that no single settlement could achieve in isolation. Trade routes emerged, connecting the various settlements in networks that grew more complex and extensive with each generation. Young traders, carrying goods on their backs or leading pack animals, walked paths that became roads through repeated use, stopping at each community to exchange local products for goods from elsewhere, carrying not just material objects, but also news and stories, techniques and ideas. These traders became important figures in the social landscape, bridges between communities, sources of information about the wider world, and catalysts for cultural exchange. Through their travels, innovation spread more quickly than they otherwise would have. good ideas finding adoption in multiple locations, unsuccessful experiments being abandoned based on reports from those who had tried them. The network of trade and communication, though primitive compared to what had existed before the flood, represented a crucial step toward the reintegration of humanity into a coherent civilization. Marriage alliances between settlements helped to cement these connections and prevent the kind of genetic isolation that could weaken the small population. Young people from one community would journey to another for arranged marriages, bringing with them the practices and knowledge of their home while learning from their new families. These marriages created kinship networks that spanned the inhabited world, ensuring that disputes between settlements could often be resolved through family mediation rather than conflict, and that resources could be shared in times of shortage. The children of these unions, growing up with connections to multiple communities, became natural ambassadors and traders, comfortable moving between different groups, able to speak slightly different dialects, familiar with varied customs. Through these children, the scattered remnants of humanity began to weave themselves back into something resembling a unified culture. Atrahasis, in his final years, could look out from the village that had been the first settlement and see smoke rising from dozens of other communities scattered across the landscape, each one representing a flame of human life sustained against the darkness that had nearly consumed everything. The population was growing, slowly and within the limits established by the divine covenant, but growing nonetheless. Fields of grain rippled in the wind. Herds of animals grazed on the regenerated grasslands. Children played in the streets, their voices carrying on the breeze. And though that noise was faint compared to what had existed before the flood, it was real and vital, evidence that humanity had earned its place in the world once more. He had fulfilled the task the gods had given him, preserved life through the deluge, guided the survivors through the hardest years, and established foundations solid enough to support generations yet to come. When death came for him at last, gentle and expected, he went into the earth with the satisfaction of one who had completed his work, leaving behind a legacy that would endure as long as humans told stories and remembered the ancient days. The generations that followed Atrahasis inherited a world still marked by the flood's passage, though the scars grew less visible with each passing year. The silt that had covered everything began to break down into fertile soil, enriched by the minerals and organic matter the waters had carried from distant lands. Vegetation returned with vigor once the initial colonizers had prepared the ground, forests growing where there had been none before, grasslands spreading across plains that the flood had leveled. The river courses stabilized, finding new channels through the transformed landscape, their annual floods becoming predictable again, bringing life-giving water to the fields without the catastrophic excess that had drowned the world. Humanity adapted to this renewed earth, learning its rhythms, discovering its resources, slowly rebuilding the infrastructure of civilization that had been lost beneath the waters. The settlements that had begun as small clusters of reed houses gradually transformed into villages with more permanent structures. Mud brick, that ancient Mesopotamian building material made from clay, mixed with straw and dried in the sun, returned to common use as people remembered or rediscovered the techniques for its manufacture. Houses rose with solid walls that could withstand years of weather, their forms echoing the architectural traditions that had existed before the flood, even though the builders worked from memory and experimentation rather than from direct instruction. Public buildings appeared, structures larger than individual dwellings that served as gathering places, storage facilities, and temples. These early public works were modest compared to the monuments of the Old World, but they represented the same impulse toward collective action and shared resources that had always characterized human civilization at its best. The art of pottery advanced beyond the simple vessels of the immediate post-flood period, with artisans developing techniques for creating finer clay bodies, more sophisticated shapes, and decorative elements that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Potters learned to control their firing temperatures, producing ceramics that were harder and more durable, and they began to mark their works with distinctive patterns and motifs that identified the maker and the settlement of origin. These decorative elements, simple geometric patterns at first, gradually became more complex, incorporating stylized representations of animals and plants, abstract symbols whose meanings were sometimes functional and sometimes purely ornamental. The development of these visual vocabularies, shared among settlements through trade and imitation, created a common aesthetic language that helped to unify the scattered communities and establish cultural continuity across the inhabited world. Writing, which had been slowly recovering through the efforts of the memorizers and experimenters, reached a critical threshold several generations after the flood, when someone made the conceptual leap from pictographic representation to phonetic notation. This innovation, the idea that symbols could represent sounds rather than only objects or ideas, opened up vast new possibilities for recording complex information. Suddenly, it became possible to capture not just inventories and simple records, but also narratives, poetry, instructions, legal codes, and religious texts. The cuneiform script that emerged from this breakthrough, pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, was not identical to what had existed before the flood, but it served the same purposes and would eventually develop into a writing system as sophisticated as any that had preceded it. Scribal schools appeared in the larger settlements, training young people in the art of writing, and with literacy came an explosion of recorded knowledge that accelerated the recovery of civilization. The religious understanding of the flood evolved as it was transmitted through generations who had not experienced it directly. The story became more formalized, taking on the structure and language of sacred myth, each telling polishing the narrative until it achieved a kind of perfection that could be reproduced exactly by skilled reciters. When scribes began writing down these oral traditions, preserving them in clay for the first time since the deluge, they created texts that would endure for thousands of years, surviving the rise and fall of empires, waiting in ruined libraries to be discovered by archaeologists who would marvel at their antiquity and recognize in them the sources for later flood narratives from other cultures. The Atrahasis Epic, as it came to be known, existed in multiple versions, each reflecting the priorities and understanding of the scribes who recorded it, but all sharing the essential narrative of creation, rebellion, divine frustration, and catastrophic flood, followed by salvation and renewal. Cities began to emerge again as certain settlements grew larger and more complex, accumulating population and resources until they required more sophisticated forms of organization and governance. The first of these post-flood cities were small compared to the urban centers that had existed before the deluge, but they represented the same basic pattern of concentrated humanity living in close quarters, specialized labor, hierarchical social structures, and monumental architecture. Temple complexes rose at the centers of these cities, ziggurats built in steps that reached toward the heavens, their mud brick cores covered in fired brick or plaster, their summits crowned with shrines where priests performed rituals that maintained the connection between earth and the divine realm. These temples were not merely religious structures, but also administrative centers, storehouses, and workshops, the organizational hearts of complex urban societies. Kings emerged to rule these cities, individuals who claimed descent from Atrahasis or divine favor, or simply the strength and cunning necessary to impose order on fractious populations. Kingship in this era was less formalized than it would later become, more personal and contingent, dependent on the individual ruler's ability to maintain loyalty and deliver protection. The early kings built palaces, though these were often modest compared to the temples, and they established courts, though these were small and relatively simple. They commissioned works of art and architecture to glorify their reigns and ensure their remembrance, understanding instinctively that power required spectacle and that legitimacy could be enhanced through association with the divine. The relationship between temple and palace, between priestly authority and royal power, would become one of the defining tensions of Mesopotamian civilization, a dynamic that shaped politics and culture for thousands of years. Trade expanded as the cities grew, extending beyond the river valleys into distant regions where different resources could be obtained. Merchants traveled routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia to the north, the Levant to the west, the Persian plateau to the east, and the Persian Gulf to the south. They brought back timber from mountain forests, stone from quarries in highland regions, metals that could not be found in the alluvial plains, precious materials like lapis lazuli and carnelian that came from sources so distant that their exact locations were shrouded in mystery. This long-distance trade required organization, the development of systems for measuring value and facilitating exchange, the creation of merchant networks and trading partnerships that could span great distances and bridge cultural differences. The accumulated wealth from this commerce funded the construction of monuments and the patronage of arts, creating the material foundation for cultural flourishing. The flood remained a central reference point in this developing civilization, a touchstone that explained why things were as they were, why suffering existed alongside joy, why population growth was limited by mortality, why the gods required constant worship and appeasement. Every spring, when the rivers rose with snowmelt from distant mountains, people watched the waters with a mixture of hope and fear, grateful for the irrigation they provided, but anxious that they might rise too high and repeat the catastrophe that had destroyed the world. Flood defences were built, levees and canals that channeled and controlled the waters, representing humanity's attempt to manage the forces that had once overwhelmed them. These hydraulic works, constantly maintained and expanded, became symbols of civilization itself, of human capacity to shape nature and create order from chaos, though always with the understanding that this order was contingent and could be revoked if the gods chose to do so. The covenant between gods and humans, established in the aftermath of the deluge, was regularly renewed through ritual and sacrifice. Major festivals marked the seasons and the agricultural cycle, occasions when entire communities gathered to offer prayers and gifts to the divine powers who controlled rain and sun, fertility and harvest. These festivals served multiple purposes beyond their religious function, providing opportunities for social bonding, for resolving disputes, for arranging marriages, for trading goods, for sharing news and information. The calendar itself was structured around religious observances, with months named for gods or agricultural activities, time measured not by abstract numbers but by the rhythm of planting and harvest, of high water and low, of rituals that anchored human activity to cosmic patterns. Scholarship emerged as a recognized vocation as literacy spread and accumulated knowledge required specialists to master and transmit it. Schools attached to temples trained scribes in writing and mathematics, in the observation of celestial phenomena, in the performance of rituals, in the interpretation of omens and signs. These scribal scholars became the intellectual elite of Mesopotamian society, preserving and elaborating the wisdom that had been recovered from the pre-flood world and adding to it through their own observations and innovations. They developed sophisticated mathematical systems for calculation and measurement, astronomical knowledge for predicting seasons and eclipses, medical understanding for treating illness and injury, legal frameworks for managing disputes and maintaining order. The libraries they compiled, collections of clay tablets stored in temple and palace archives, represented humanity's growing mastery of recorded knowledge and its determination never again to lose the accumulated wisdom of generations. Among the texts preserved in these libraries, the Atrahasis Epic held a special place, copied and recopied by generations of scribes, studied by students learning to write, recited at festivals and royal ceremonies. The story served as moral instruction, warning against the dangers of excess and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the divine. It explained the nature of humanity, created to serve the gods, formed from earth and divine blood, carrying within the dual nature of mortality and awareness. It justified the suffering that people experienced, the diseases and famines, the difficulties of childbirth, the deaths of children, all presented as necessary limitations established by divine decree to prevent another catastrophic flood. And it offered hope, the promise that humanity had survived its greatest test, that the gods had chosen to preserve rather than destroy, that life would continue under the terms of a covenant that, if honored, would protect the world from another deluge. Other flood narratives emerged, variations on the basic theme, each reflecting the perspectives and concerns of different communities and periods. Some versions emphasized different aspects of the story, focused on different heroes, included details that were absent from other accounts or omitted elements that seemed central elsewhere. The Sumerian flood story featured Ziusudra as the survivor. Later Akkadian versions named Utnapishtim. But all these narratives shared the essential structure of the Atrahasis Epic, the pattern of divine frustration with human noise or sin, the decision to send a flood, the warning given to a chosen individual, the building of a boat, the survival through the deluge, and the establishment of a new relationship between gods and humans. These stories, told and retold across centuries and cultures, became foundational myths not only for Mesopotamia, but for the entire ancient Near East, influencing traditions that would spread far beyond the rivers where they originated. The passage of time brought changes to the landscape and to human society, but the memory of the flood persisted, embedded in cultural consciousness at a level so deep that it shaped how people understood their place in the cosmos. The cities grew larger and more numerous. Empires rose, claiming dominion over wide territories, imposing unified administration on diverse populations. Technologies advanced, bringing new capabilities and new challenges. Social structures became more complex, with increasing differentiation between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. Through all these transformations, the flood narrative remained constant, a reminder of vulnerability and dependence, of the fragility of human achievement and the power of forces beyond mortal control. It was a story of endings and beginnings, of destruction and preservation, and it continued to resonate because it spoke to fundamental aspects of the human experience that transcended any particular time or place. The clay tablets on which the Atrahasis Epic was recorded, pressed into wet earth by scribes working in temple scriptoriums thousands of years ago, were remarkably durable under the right conditions. In the dry climate of Mesopotamia, tablets that were baked hard in kilns or accidentally fired when buildings burned could survive for millennia, their cuneiform impressions as legible as the day they were made. But durability did not ensure preservation. Cities were conquered and destroyed, libraries were scattered or burned deliberately, tablets were broken and discarded, and the knowledge they contained was forgotten as languages changed and the script itself fell out of use. For centuries, then millennia, the Atrahasis Epic existed only as fragments buried in the ruins of ancient cities, silent voices waiting beneath the accumulated debris of collapsed civilizations, their stories suspended in darkness until chance and scholarship brought them back into light. The cities where these tablets once resided had long since fallen into ruin. Babylon, that great metropolis that had stood for thousands of years as a center of learning and power, was abandoned, its massive walls crumbling, its famous hanging gardens gone to dust and legend. Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, lay beneath mounds of earth that local populations used as sources for bricks and building materials, unaware that they were quarrying from the remains of palaces and libraries. Sippar, where some versions of the Atrahasis Epic had been copied and stored, became a tell, a hill of accumulated debris rising from the flat plain, inhabited by jackals and visited only by shepherds seeking high ground. The knowledge these cities had contained, the vast accumulated learning of Mesopotamian civilization, seemed lost forever, replaced by new cultures, new languages, new religions that had no memory of the old gods or the stories told about them. Yet beneath the surface, in the stratified layers of these ancient tells, the tablets waited. Some were crushed by the weight of fallen walls, others dissolved when exposed to moisture seeping through the soil. But many remained intact, sealed in rooms that had collapsed and buried them, protected from the elements by the very destruction that had ended their use. They lay in darkness, sometimes for 2,000 years, sometimes for 3,000, while empires rose and fell above them, while Christianity spread across the Near East and then Islam, while the Crusades were fought and the Ottoman Empire expanded, while the Industrial Revolution transformed distant Europe. Through all of this, the tablets remained unchanged, patient witnesses to a history that the world had forgotten, waiting for the moment when curiosity and scholarship would converge to bring them back into human awareness. That moment came in the 19th century, when European and American archaeologists, driven by biblical interests and imperial ambition, began excavating the great mounds of Mesopotamia. They sought confirmation of biblical narratives, evidence of the kingdoms mentioned in Scripture, the physical remains of civilizations that had been reduced to names and legends. What they found exceeded their expectations. Beneath the tells lay entire cities, their streets and houses preserved, their temples and palaces filled with artifacts, and most remarkably, their libraries intact, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with a script that no one in the modern world could read. These tablets were collected, shipped to museums in London and Paris and Berlin and New York, where scholars began the painstaking work of decipherment, learning the ancient languages, cracking the code of cuneiform, gradually reconstructing the intellectual world of ancient Mesopotamia. Among the tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh were fragments of the Atrahasis Epic, pieces of a narrative that scholars initially struggled to understand and contextualize. The language was Akkadian, written in cuneiform, and the content described events and characters that seemed fantastical, a creation story involving gods laboring like humans, a flood that covered the earth, a boat built to preserve life. As more fragments were discovered and translated, connections began to emerge. This flood story bore striking similarities to the biblical account of Noah and the Ark, but it was clearly much older, written in a language that predated Hebrew, preserved on tablets that could be dated to periods long before the composition of Genesis. The implications were profound and controversial, suggesting that the biblical flood narrative had roots in earlier Mesopotamian traditions, that the stories told as unique divine revelation were actually part of a larger complex of ancient Near Eastern mythology. The scholars who worked on these texts, dusty men in university libraries, far from the lands where the tablets had been found, began to piece together the fragmentary narrative. They discovered that the Atrahasis Epic existed in multiple versions, that it had been copied and recopied over more than 1,000 years, that scribes had made variations and additions as they transmitted the text. The earliest versions dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1,700 years before the Common Era, though the story itself was clearly older, drawing on Sumerian traditions that reached back to the 3rd millennium. Later versions showed the influence of changing religious ideas and political circumstances, reflecting the concerns of different eras while maintaining the core narrative structure. Through patient comparison of these versions, through the laborious work of translation and interpretation, the scholars reconstructed a text that had been lost to human knowledge for more than 2 millennia. The rediscovery of the Atrahasis Epic and its relationship to the biblical flood narrative sparked intense debate in academic and religious circles. For some, it was evidence that the Bible was not unique divine revelation, but rather a compilation of earlier traditions, adapted and transformed by Israelite authors for their own theological purposes. For others, it suggested a common memory of an actual historical flood, a catastrophic event so traumatic that it was preserved in the mythologies of multiple cultures. Still others saw in the parallels simply the universal human tendency to tell similar stories, to use flood imagery to express themes of divine judgment, human sinfulness, and the possibility of redemption and renewal. These debates continue to the present day, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, but productive in their way, generating scholarship and discussion that has deepened our understanding of both the ancient texts and the cultures that produced them. The Atrahasis Epic also illuminated aspects of Mesopotamian religion and society that had been poorly understood. The story of humanity's creation from clay and divine blood provided insight into how ancient peoples conceptualized the relationship between mortals and gods. The idea that humans carried within themselves both earthly materiality and divine essence, that they were simultaneously lowly and exalted, created to serve but capable of communication with higher powers. The narrative of divine frustration with human noise and the decision to limit population through mortality and hardship revealed a worldview in which suffering was not punishment for individual sin, but rather a structural necessity, a mechanism built into the fabric of existence to maintain cosmic balance. These were sophisticated theological concepts, showing that ancient Mesopotamians thought deeply about fundamental questions of existence, purpose, and the nature of the divine. The epic's treatment of the flood itself, described in vivid detail with attention to the experience of those inside the ark and the transformation of the landscape, provided a model that influenced numerous later narratives. The Gilgamesh epic, that masterwork of ancient literature discovered in the same library of Ashurbanipal, incorporated a flood story featuring Utnapishtim that was clearly related to the Atrahasis tradition, though adapted to serve different narrative purposes. The biblical account in Genesis, while theologically distinct with its monotheism and moral framework, followed the same basic pattern of warning, boat construction, deluge, landing, and sacrifice. Later flood traditions from Greek mythology, Hindu scripture, and indigenous cultures around the world showed similar structures, raising questions about whether these represented independent developments responding to universal human fears or evidence of cultural transmission and shared historical memory. Modern readers encountering the Atrahasis epic for the first time often find it both familiar and strange. The basic narrative of a great flood is recognizable, embedded in cultural consciousness through biblical tradition and countless retellings, but the details are foreign. The gods capricious and anthropomorphic in ways that differ from monotheistic conceptions of the divine. The casual acceptance of divine violence, the matter-of-fact description of genocide, the lack of moral judgment on the gods' decision to destroy humanity, all challenge modern sensibilities shaped by different ethical frameworks. Yet the text also speaks to enduring human concerns, the fear of catastrophic destruction, the hope for preservation and continuity, the question of humanity's purpose and place in a cosmos governed by powers beyond mortal comprehension. These themes transcend cultural and temporal boundaries, making the ancient epic relevant even to audiences separated from its composition by 4,000 years and vast differences in worldview. The physical tablets themselves, housed now in climate-controlled museum storage and occasionally displayed in exhibitions, are objects of profound historical significance. Each one represents not merely a text, but a material link to the ancient past, touched by human hands long since returned to dust, inscribed by scribes whose names are mostly lost, read by priests and scholars and students in temple schools that are now only archaeological remains. The clay from which they were formed came from the same river valleys where the flood was said to have occurred, shaped by the same processes of sedimentation and deposition that the deluge itself would have accelerated. In a poetic sense, the tablets are made from the flood, from the silt and mud that covered the world, formed into new shapes that would carry the memory of that catastrophe forward into ages that the original storytellers could never have imagined. Conservation efforts to preserve these tablets continue in the present day, using technologies that would seem like magic to the ancient scribes who created them. Digital imaging captures every detail of the cuneiform impressions, creating permanent records that will survive even if the physical tablets deteriorate. Chemical treatments stabilize the clay, preventing further decay. Climate control protects against the humidity and temperature fluctuations that cause cracking and degradation. Through these methods, scholars ensure that the Atrahasis Epic will remain accessible to future generations, that the story of humanity's creation and near destruction will continue to be told as long as there are people interested in the deep history of human thought and expression. The voices of ancient Mesopotamia, silent for so long, have been recovered and will not easily be silenced again. The academic study of the Atrahasis Epic has evolved as new tablets have been discovered and new methodologies have been developed. Computer analysis allows for sophisticated comparison of different versions, tracking changes in vocabulary and phrasing across time periods and scribal traditions. Archaeological context provides information about where and how tablets were stored, what other texts they were associated with, what this reveals about their function and importance in ancient society. Anthropological perspectives illuminate the social and political contexts that shape the narrative, the ways it served to legitimate power structures or express resistance to them. Literary analysis treats the epic as a work of art, attending to its structure and imagery, its use of repetition and variation, its emotional power and narrative craft. Through these varied approaches, the Atrahasis Epic has become not merely a historical curiosity, but a rich text that rewards sustained attention and careful study. Yet for all the scholarly apparatus that surrounds it, the epic retains a directness and simplicity that makes it accessible to non-specialist readers. The story is fundamentally straightforward, its basic movements easily followed even across the gulf of translation and cultural difference. Gods create humans for labor. Humans multiply and become noisy. Gods send punishments culminating in a flood. One wise man preserves life by building a boat. The flood subsides and life begins again under new terms. This narrative clarity, combined with vivid descriptive passages and moments of genuine pathos, gives the text an enduring appeal beyond its historical or theological significance. It works as story, as myth, as literature, inviting readers into an ancient worldview while speaking to concerns that remain relevant in the present. The Atrahasis Epic, when we step back from its particulars and consider it whole, speaks to fundamental aspects of what it means to be human, questions that have occupied thoughtful people in every age and culture. Why do we exist? What is our purpose in the cosmos? Why is life marked by suffering and limitation? Why do we die? The ancient Mesopotamians who shaped this narrative into its enduring form were grappling with the same mysteries that still perplex us, and their answers, preserved in clay and recovered from ruins, offer a perspective both alien and familiar, a window into a worldview separated from ours by vast differences in knowledge and belief, yet united by common humanity and shared concerns. The gods in this story are not distant abstractions, but active presences, making decisions that affect the world, responding to circumstances with emotions we recognize, capable of both wrath and mercy, wisdom and foolishness. The creation of humanity from clay and divine blood suggests a dual nature, rooted in earth, yet touched by something higher, mortal yet conscious, created for servitude, yet capable of creativity and choice. This conception differs from modern understandings of human origins, whether religious or scientific, yet it captures something true about the human experience of being caught between limitations and aspirations, between the needs of the body and the yearnings of the spirit. We are made, the story tells us, from the substance of the world itself, shaped from the same mud that forms the riverbanks, yet animated by a spark that connects us to powers and possibilities beyond the merely material. This dual heritage explains both our capabilities and our constraints, our capacity to build civilizations and our vulnerability to forces we cannot control, our awareness of mortality and our desire for something more enduring than individual life. The flood itself, that central catastrophe around which the entire narrative revolves, functions on multiple levels. At the most literal, it may preserve memory of actual flooding events, catastrophic inundations that occurred in ancient Mesopotamia when rivers overflowed their banks or storm surges from the Persian Gulf pushed inland, devastating settlements and leaving survivors with traumatic memories passed down through generations. The archaeological record shows evidence of significant flooding in the region's deep past, though whether any single event could account for the story's universal scope remains uncertain. More important than historical basis, however, is mythological function. The flood represents divine judgment, the power of the gods to unmake what they have made, to restore the world to primordial chaos when order becomes intolerable. It expresses the fear of annihilation that haunts human consciousness, the knowledge that everything we build can be destroyed, that catastrophe can erase civilization and return the earth to silence. Yet the flood is not merely destruction, it is also purification and renewal, a cleansing that removes corruption and allows a fresh start. The world that emerges from the waters is transformed, stripped of its accumulated mistakes and excesses, ready to begin again with lessons learned from the previous cycle. This pattern of destruction and renewal appears throughout mythology and religious thought, from Hindu cosmology, with its cycles of creation and dissolution, to the Christian concept of apocalypse followed by new creation, from seasonal myths of dying and reviving gods to personal narratives of crisis and redemption. The flood in Atrahasis established a template, a way of understanding catastrophic change as both ending and beginning, as loss that makes space for new growth, as suffering that can lead to wisdom. The pattern resonates because it reflects genuine aspects of experience at both individual and collective levels, the way crisis forces change, the way destruction can precede transformation. The preservation of life through the flood, embodied in Atrahasis and his arc, speaks to themes of survival and continuity that are equally fundamental to human concerns. In the face of overwhelming catastrophe, when everything seems lost, a remnant perseveres, carrying forward the essential elements that will allow recovery and renewal. This is not triumph through strength, but survival through wisdom, through foresight and preparation, through willingness to act on warnings that others ignore, through acceptance of guidance from sources beyond personal understanding. Atrahasis survives not because he is the strongest, or the most numerous, or the most powerful, but because he is wise enough to listen, humble enough to obey, and diligent enough to prepare. These virtues, celebrated in the Epic, reflect values that ancient Mesopotamian culture considered essential: the importance of wisdom over strength, of preparation over improvisation, of divine favor over human capability alone. The covenant established after the flood, limiting human population through built-in mortality and hardship, addresses the problem that provoked the catastrophe while allowing humanity to continue. This solution recognizes that unrestricted growth leads to crisis, that sustainability requires limits, that the relationship between humans and the larger order of things must be balanced rather than one-sided. Modern readers might see in this ancient insight a prescient awareness of issues that dominate contemporary discourse: questions of population, resource consumption, environmental limits, and the sustainability of growth-oriented economic systems. The ancient solution differs from modern prescriptions, relying on divine decree rather than human policy, accepting suffering as necessary rather than seeking to eliminate it through technology and planning. But the underlying recognition that limits exist and must be respected remains relevant across the millennia. The gods' need for human worship, revealed when they gather hungrily around Atrahasis' sacrifice after the flood, introduces a dimension of mutual dependence into the divine-human relationship. The gods are not entirely self-sufficient. They require the offerings and prayers of mortals, the validation that worship provides, the service that humanity was created to perform. This dependence creates a kind of covenant, an implicit contract in which humans provide worship and the gods provide the order and protection that makes life possible. Neither party can simply dominate or ignore the other without consequences. The relationship must be maintained through ongoing interaction, through rituals and festivals, through the continuous acknowledgement of roles and responsibilities. This conception of religion differs sharply from monotheistic traditions that emphasize God's absolute independence and humanity's total dependence, but it reflects a genuine insight about the social and psychological functions of religious practice, the ways worship creates meaning and community, the ways ritual connects individuals to larger patterns and purposes. The preservation of this story across thousands of years, its transmission through scribal copying, its survival in buried libraries, its recovery by modern archaeology, and its continued study and retelling in the present day all testify to something enduring in the narrative's appeal and significance. Stories that persist across such vast stretches of time do so because they speak to something fundamental and recurring in human experience, because they address questions that each generation must answer anew, because they provide frameworks for understanding aspects of existence that resist simpler explanations. The Atrahasis Epic has survived because it continues to function, not as literal history or scientific explanation, but as myth in the deepest sense, as a narrative that gives shape to inchoate experiences and articulates truths that cannot be captured in purely factual statements. Stories like the Atrahasis Epic offer a kind of companionship across time, a reminder that others before us have faced similar questions and uncertainties, that the fundamental mysteries of existence are not unique to our era, but have always been with us. The ancient Mesopotamians who first told this story looked up at the same stars we see, watched the same moon wax and wane, experienced the same alternation of day and night, birth and death, planting and harvest. Their circumstances differed from ours in countless ways, but their humanity was the same, and their attempts to make sense of existence, to find meaning and pattern in the chaos of experience, to connect themselves to something larger and more enduring than individual lives, these attempts speak across the centuries with clarity and force. The physical landscape where this story first took form has changed dramatically since ancient times. The great cities are ruins, their ziggurats dissolved into shapeless mounds, their irrigation systems long since abandoned, their populations dispersed or replaced by peoples with different languages and traditions. The Euphrates and Tigris still flow, but their courses have shifted, their waters are diminished, and the civilizations they sustained have passed into history. The environment itself has transformed. What were once marshes and wetlands have been drained or altered. What were forests have become deserts. The climate has changed in subtle ways that accumulate over millennia. Yet the story persists, carried forward not in stone monuments or geographic features, but in the more durable medium of narrative, in words and images that can be transmitted across time and space, independent of the specific locations and cultures that gave them birth. In our own age, marked by rapid change and uncertainty, by technological capabilities that would seem like magic to ancient peoples, by scientific understanding that reveals a cosmos vastly larger and older than the mythological worldview could encompass, the Atrahasis Epic might seem merely an antiquarian curiosity, a relic of superseded beliefs. Yet it retains power precisely because it operates at a level beneath technological and scientific change, addressing aspects of existence that remain constant despite transformations in how we understand the physical world. We still face mortality, still wonder about purpose, still fear catastrophic loss, still hope for preservation and renewal, still seek to understand our place in a universe that often seems indifferent to our presence. The specific answers provided by the epic may no longer satisfy, but the questions it addresses remain vital, and engaging with the ancient narrative can deepen our appreciation of how humans across cultures and epochs have struggled with these enduring mysteries. The story of Atrahasis, exceedingly wise, who listened to the voice of a god speaking through a reed wall, who built his ark and weathered the deluge, who offered sacrifice on the mountain and saw the world begin again, continues to resonate across the millennia. The gods have grown silent, their temples fallen, their names known now only to scholars and storytellers. But the pattern they embodied persists, the cycle of creation and destruction, the balance of order and chaos, the fragile miracle of consciousness arising from clay and returning to it, the brief flicker of awareness between vast silences that preceded and will follow human existence. In the perspective of deep time that this ancient epic provides, our individual concerns become small but not insignificant, particular moments in a pattern that extends far beyond personal experience, connected to those who came before and those who will follow, part of a continuity that survives all catastrophes. The Atrahasis Epic, preserved in broken tablets of clay, offers us this connection to our distant past, a window into how our ancestors understood their world and their place in it. The narrative ends where it began, with humanity existing in a delicate balance between earth and heaven, between mortality and meaning, between the limitations of clay and the spark of something more, fulfilling a purpose they did not choose but can still embrace with dignity and wisdom. The story has been told across 4,000 years, carried from one generation to the next, and in its endurance we find evidence of what stories can do, how they preserve not just information but understanding, not just facts but frameworks for making sense of the human condition across all the transformations of history and culture.